Well, I'm just going to jump in here, Craig. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'll introduce myself along the way. So I'll probably move fairly quickly. That's kind of my style. I'm also tend to be very interactive in the classroom. But today I just wanted to give you a brief overview of operations management and talk a little bit about this relationship between operations and also strategy. So about myself, educated mostly at the University of Wisconsin. As an undergraduate, I studied religion with an emphasis in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, but as I tell people, there aren't a lot of jobs in that work. So I had to switch to something a little different. I've worked with both private sector companies and also nonprofits. I spent a little over a decade working for a very large nonprofit, the U.S. Department of Defense. So that's kind of a little bit about my background and enough. But let me just talk about considering alternatives in an operational context, and we'll talk a little bit about choosing those things. And I also want to talk some today about managing bottlenecks and basically choke points, especially in this era of COVID, and we're in our second year, and as the supply chains there's a lot of shifting going on in demand. We'll talk a little bit about that. So first, we have to start with an objective. What's our goal? The goal is going to determine everything about how we execute. Describe the process. We want to describe what we're looking at. We want to decide how and what we're going to measure, choose the methods to conduct the analysis, identify some feasible alternatives, and then consider some risks. So I began my career out of grad school at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California. It was the first think tank here in the United States. And in the 1950s through the 1970s, RAND spent a lot of time working on Cold War problems, so big strategy problems. A lot of basic research was developed there: game theory, packet switching for the internet, linear programming, a lot of things to deal with how would the United States compete against the Soviet Union and win. And at the time, there was an early question, one of the earliest questions put forth to RAND, and Albert Wohlstetter was on this team. And basically, the Air Force was asking, where should we put bases? At the time, there were no intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so all nuclear weapons would be dropped out of airplanes if it came to a nuclear war. And so they wanted to know, where should they put their bases around the world so they could be close enough to strike. And it came up at the end. RAND did this kind of detailed analysis and said, the closer you are to the enemy, the closer you are to the enemy, meaning that if you put the bases close so that you can strike quickly, you're also close to be struck. And so they reframed the problem. And so in the words of Richard Rummelt, who wrote a book it's pretty decent book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, he says three things of good strategies. Good strategies are coherent, they're unexpected, and they rely upon discovered power. And discovered power often comes from reframing the question. And so the question was reframed to, instead of where should we put our bases, how close should they be to the enemy? Let's get rid of the bases and let's just keep B-52 strategic bombers in the air all the time. And so to do that, suddenly you need a whole new array of technologies like in-flight refueling. So that pivot of the question of where should we put the bases to, let's not put any strategic bomber forward bases out, let's keep planes in the air all the time, was a really critical reframing. And I find that creative act is often the most powerful thing that we can do from both a strategic but also an operational standpoint. So if we think about companies like Walmart, and how they frame the question. Walmart still in the retail game, many fewer retailers out there this year than were in 2019. And how have they done that? How has Walmart succeeded? Well, they have a corporate strategy of providing customers access to quality goods at low prices, but how do they do that? Well, they have short flow times, meaning things flow through their stores very, very quickly. How do they do that? Well, they only carry the top 5 market leaders, okay? If you want bar soap, You can go into Walmart, you can get your, ivory, probably have some Irish Spring over there, sprinkle a little zest on yourself. But if you're wanting that, exquisite yak milk, oatmeal infused honeysuckle rose soap, that's probably at the other place because that doesn't move in volume. And what they're trying to do is short flow times, low inventory levels. How do they do that? Well, through a cross-docking process, electronic data interchange. So when you scan that item at the scanner in the Walmart, your local Walmart store, that's sending a signal all the way back to Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, Ohio, telling them that they sold a gallon of Tide at that particular store, and they can reduce something that's called the bullwhip effect. They basically can shrink the inventory and the time necessary to restock that. Fast transportation system, focus location. So this is how they do it, but they do it because they're focused. So I often put this question to students in the class and ask just how long does it take you to fill up your car? And we go through this process of, well, it depends on whether you pay at the pump or you pay inside, or if you're getting a drink. Okay, how long does it take in Formula One? Well, in Formula One, it's a little quicker. And why? Well, because the entire system is designed for one thing and one thing only: speed. So strategically, we have three trade-offs. You want to be good, you want to be fast, you want to be cheap, pick two. So Formula One is really focused on one. And so when you look at how long does it take to refuel the car, well, about 7 seconds. But what else is happening? Well, we're also changing tires. We may be making some adjustments to the frame. But you'll also notice that this is a human resources nightmare and disaster. There's 23 people standing around here, right? But it's not about cost. It's about one thing: speed, and everything about the system is designed for that, down to one lug nut on the wheel because of speed. So moving on, let's just, when you focus the problem very, very narrowly, everything in the entire system will start to pivot around that, and everything from the design, the human resources, who you're recruiting, how you're training people, everything can go into that, and it helps an organization focus. I often start with this model in terms of basic process components. Now we're starting to, let's just describe a problem. Once you've defined what is the organization's goal, and you may have to redefine this goal over time, but once the organization has a goal, let's look at their process. So typically, I rely upon this very, very basic model. If you're familiar with Six Sigma, they might call this a SIPOC diagram for suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, customers. I just call it a basic process diagram. So we start with the process, and then we have a purpose. What are we doing? And more importantly, why are we doing it? What are we in the business of? Education and learning, in the business of providing consumer products at a low price. What is it? So we have a purpose, our why, and then we have some inputs: people, machines, energy, and that which we cannot make more of, at least yet, is time. And then we have outputs: products or services. I tend to believe that there are fewer and fewer products, meaning people don't necessarily want the thing, the physical object. They want the service or the outcome that the thing helps them realize. So I believe there are more and more services. Fewer and fewer people are going to want cars. More and more people are going to want reliable, fast, safe transportation, which may be in a car, but you don't necessarily own it. It just shows up when you summon it. And then we have customers who are using that output of our products, and the customers have needs. And if you want to uncover latent needs of a customer, ask them, why do they want it? How do they use it? Don't ask a customer what they want, because if you ask them what they want, they're not going to tell you that they want a face phone. Okay, they're going to tell you something else. In fact, they don't even want a phone. This isn't a phone. Most of the time, we're not talking on it. We are keying on it, or we are talking to it, because the global tech war is around voice. The future is voice, because no one wants to deal with a keyboard anymore. So why do they want it? How do they use it? And then we have some communication channels between the customers and our own process. Maybe that's electronic data interchange. Maybe it's just purchase orders. It could be a complete lack. That's dangerous of communication, but we'll probably have some just at the very base level purchase orders. But how deliberate we are, or how much we neglect this relationship, will determine outcomes. And then from our suppliers, we have inputs that we're getting from our supplier. Our suppliers have their own processes, and we may have some communication channels with them. And we're operating in the context of an environment, the business environment. There could be a global pandemic that's contributing to the environment, the national security environment. So all these things are taking place within a context. And as leaders and managers, the most important thing that you can provide your people is context. If you're in the business of sorting, searching, or collating electronic or digital data, or data that can be read digitally, you need to get out of that now. You need to be moving to the exits. I just yelled fire, because a machine is going to be doing that job very soon. Your job as a leader is to provide context. Why does all this matter? Okay, let's keep moving. So once we've defined, we've looked at our process, we know why we're doing it, we know our purpose, we know the value that we provide to our customers, what they're trying to do with the goodness of our results, and how we're transforming the inputs or the supplies or services from our suppliers. Now we want to maybe measure. And so we're going to need baseline measures. Sometimes you can refer to these as vital signs. Lots of different ways to measure. In finance, oftentimes net present value. Ratio measures like return on equity, return on assets, survival measures, which I always love, cash flow. That's what startups deal with, cash flow. So, or operational incomes. If you work for a nonprofit, really that's what you're measuring, or operational outcomes. If you're for profit, you basically plan finances for operational outcomes. If you're a nonprofit, you budget for operational outcomes. So can you run a school or a hospital or some other nonprofit like a business? Yes, but you are really concerned about operational outcomes. Okay, you're budgeting for operations. If you're for profit, you're planning financially for operational outcomes. And then operational measures, throughput, utilization, service rates. We pay attention to these from an operational standpoint, but anytime you're managing an organization, always speak in the language of the decision maker. Typically, it's dollars. Again, if you're in the nonprofit sector, it's going to be some type of operational outcome, like Jake said earlier, like public safety. So 3 options for addressing a bottleneck. Basically, there are only 3 ways to manage a bottleneck. Increase the capacity, so add more resources, manage what flows into it, or go around it. What do we mean by managing what goes into it? Well, it could be congestion-based pricing. So it could be like the toll roads operate. It could be you're going in to get a mortgage. You don't just walk in off the street and sit down with a loan officer. The loan officer has been trained and is charged with taking risk on behalf of the bank. So they're going to screen you first, because that loan officer's time is expensive, more expensive than someone that's there as a teller. So you're going to be screened. You have to stand in front of the terminal and enter in all of your assets and give them a sense of how risky you are before you can talk to a loan officer. So that's an example of managing inflow to a bottleneck. Both of those are. And we use a little something in operations called Little's Law, which is just a relationship between the average number of things in the system. This could be inventory in terms of boxes, or this could be patients waiting in a waiting room of an emergency room. And that number is equal to the throughput rate times the average time waiting in the system. And this really simple little relationship can yield a lot of fascinating insights. And we can complicate this formula a little bit. And we do this in operations management for looking at more than one server. But I find oftentimes just looking at the relationship between a single queue and arrivals and wait times is sufficient to get back of the envelope kind of strategic and operational level insight. And what we know about this is essentially the higher the utilization rate in the system, meaning the more busy it is, the longer the wait time. It turns out that as you increase the busyness of the system, these are the number of customers in the system, the number of people in the system, and the time that they're in the system is going to increase, and it's going to increase non-linearly. So that when you're very, very highly utilized, over 90% utilized, you're extremely busy, you get a lot of variability in the system. So on average, maybe there are 38 customers in the system, but there's a non-zero probability that at times you're going to end up with 70 or more people in the system. So this is just a relationship between utilization rates in a system and wait times, or the number of people, or it could be ships waiting in Long Beach right now. So you've got 40 plus on any given day. It can be 80 ships waiting at the port of Long Beach to get in, and that's just because that's a bottleneck in our supply chain coming from Asia. and they're experiencing this kind of relationship right now. We look at cases in our class. So we may look at an airport and think about what the relationship is in terms of arrivals and how do we manage airports. And airports, again, as I mentioned, 3 ways to manage a bottleneck: add more resources, add another runway. Number 2, you could filter what goes into it. So you could have peak pricing here. You could charge airlines more to land at peak times during the day, or go around it. You want to go to Liberty Airport? Welcome to Teterboro or LaGuardia or some other airport in the region. And then I often shift our discussion from here to usually some type of a real life type of example. And we might just go over here. Here we are, to the Port-au-Prince Airport in Haiti. And we noticed that, back in 2010 or so, we had an event that was very traumatic. And in fact, here we go. Let's back this up a few days. And we notice that before this time, the airport looked like this, not very busy. I'm not sure what your screen resolution is, but and then the airport looked like this. And so what happened? This is 2010, January. This was the earthquake. So suddenly all these planes came in. So when you first ask people, where's the bottleneck in the system, you'll say, well, here, when it's not busy, it's probably the runway. It's this off-ramp here. But now suddenly when you're highly congested and you have all these planes, now you're saying, oh, wait, well, if we want to get people off, we only have 3 gates here. But then you think, oh, wait, if I'm trying to get relief goods there or bottles of water, how am I going to get them off these planes? These types of planes don't have drop-down gates. Now the shift in the conversation is to forklifts. And this is really, really common in humanitarian operations. A lot of time it's the material handling equipment that is the thing that's going to cause the bottleneck. But that's not apparent until you actually start to dig in to the problem. So, we're looking here at Haiti. If we wanted to go to another airport, so now we can just shift our discussion to design. Let's just fly over to Germany, into Berlin. And here's the Tempelhof Airport. You see a very, very different design. You see 2 runways, and then, oh, what's this? A racetrack. This is all tarmac, by the way. And this building is one of the largest buildings under roof on Earth. And this is a racetrack. So very, very different type of design. And how did we make use of that at one time? Well, we did that during the Berlin airlift. So that design that we were looking at was very, very helpful during the Berlin airlift, when it's all about throughput and pushing things through. That was helpful. So we'll, in operations, we'll talk about these things, where the constraints are just on the basic design, and then what happens with congestion and how the bottlenecks shift. And then oftentimes we will get into how we would actually measure those. And if we wanted to just shift the discussion, sometimes I'll shift it over here to, let's say, Hurricane Maria, and looking at Puerto Rico right there. And I was asked several years ago by Homeland Security to do some estimates on port capacity. First, you're just looking at what ports matter. It turns out it's really San Juan. And then you have to determine, well, what determines port capacity? It turns out it's cranes, yard space, handling equipment, but one of these things is really going to be the bottleneck in the system. And so you're looking here at the port. There's a few different terminals that we dug into. There's yard space, there's land that's going to determine it, and how many berths that you have, and the cranes, and how fast the cranes operate, and how fast you can get trucks through gates. Here's another terminal over here, completely different type of design, a carousel type design. Here's another one over here, a company called Trailer Bridge, much smaller, but they're still in the top 3. And then we're looking at, well, what is the estimate of capacity? And we can start to, after we look through this basic process of what happens when a container arrives and it's moving through the system, we can start to get some measures and get our hands around this and start to make some estimates. So just identifying all of these pieces of the ship docks and the cranes, the containers being moved, stored in the yard, interterminal container movement, trucks loaded in the gate, then this is where all this is taking place here on our map. And so the bottleneck is really the handling equipment in the yard, it turns out, and how high you stack containers. And so we can take a spreadsheet and we can start to actually model this. And just by changing things like the throughput based upon our Little's Law example, we can start to see changes in wait time. So in fact, let me just see here. Just this. Okay, so based upon the throughput here of 5,262 containers a week, my wait time is about 1.6 days. The actual throughput for that is about 3,500. So if we want this wait time to go down, our throughput by our Little's Law equation that we looked at earlier has to go up. And so, you know, oftentimes in operations, we start to have fun with spreadsheet modeling. So we can put a little format controller in here, link that to this cell. Let's just take our minimum value of, let's make that 100. Let's make the maximum value just 10,000. And now suddenly we can start to, let's just keep an eye on this fellow right here and what's happening in terms of days. So if our throughput's only 100 per week, I'm going to have 84 days of waiting. But as I increase my throughput, we're seeing this go down. We were at 3,500. So if I only have a throughput of about 1,000 containers a week, then, you know, I'm going to be 8 days waiting. So the only way to reduce my wait time is to increase my throughput. And if I want less than a day waiting, then I'm going to have to get my throughput up to about 8,500 containers a day. And that's based just solely on our little relationship back here, Little's Law. That just tells us the average number in the system is equal to throughput rate and the wait time. Well, we can also derive the wait time as we have here based upon the throughput rate. So we look at these types of trade-offs, very simple relationships, but you can get a lot of insight through some very, very simple models. And so those are some of the things that we focus on from an operations standpoint. So let's just get back to talking about our analyzing alternatives, because I know I need to wrap up here in a few moments. So our basic considerations, just backing up again. First, start with an objective. What is our goal? You want to be good, fast, cheap, pick two. You want fast food. I always love it when the organizations put what they do right there in the name, fast food. So it's going to be fast, and what else? It's going to be cheap. I mean, if you want good, that's the other place. But I promise you, if you come here to our place, it's going to be fast and it's going to be cheap. Notice I didn't promise that other thing. So what's our goal? As soon as you define the goal and you have clarity around that, the entire organization can start to and begin to design around it. Just like we designed down to one lug nut on the Formula One car, not like your grandfather's NASCAR where there's 5 or 8 or who knows, because obviously they are not concerned with speed in the same way that F1 is, because in Formula One, there is one lug nut. It's designed in. Why? Because of speed. All right, and then we describe the process. So what are we actually doing? And what are the opportunities to change what we're doing? And the process is really describing it. It's the insights are coming from looking at our customers. If you want to add value to the customers, why do they want it? How do they use it? Look at their next process. Don't just look at what they are doing once you hand it off to them here, but look at what do they do next. They take our service or our product and they do something with it because they are trying to accomplish something. Identifying what they do next, that's an opportunity if you're an entrepreneur or even if you're an established company to add more value to your customer, create more revenue, and start to vertically integrate forward into your customer's process. Likewise, you could also vertically integrate backward into your supplier process if there are certain things that you could take over and start to do for yourself. You always just want to be cognizant also of the fact that you don't want to be disintermediated. So the publishing industry, for example, I like to read books. I have to go through a publisher who then has authors. Well, not anymore. Now the authors can communicate or sell to me directly. They might sell through a platform like an Amazon. They might sell directly through their own website, but suddenly, you know, is Penguin as valuable as it used to be? Not unless they're going to do something different. So that's disintermediation, but you're not going to see these types of relationships until you start to draw it. And I tell people that if you cannot draw it, you don't understand it. If you cannot make a picture of it, then it's likely you do not understand it. Okay. So describe the process. How and what will we measure? We're measuring operational outcomes. If we're for profit, we better also be measuring the financial outcomes, because that's the language of the decision maker. Typically the CEO, but quite often the CFO is telling the CEO that. If you're in a nonprofit, you're probably looking at operational outcomes with a very careful eye on your budget. Choose methods and conduct the analysis. So we were just talking about looking at bottlenecks and throughput analysis using Little's Law and some simple queuing models. Identify some potential alternatives. Do we want to, to put in more cranes, or do we want more yard space? It turned out that the bottleneck with the ports, in that case, was really on the ground handling equipment, and you need yard space. If it's with an airport, it might be, some combination between peak period pricing and then also adding another runway. And then we have to consider risk. And so risk, we might consider looking at tree diagrams, some different types of alternatives that come from options. We might boil it down to the Air Force really loves these types of stoplight diagrams where we give a subjective rating on the risk for them. And it might look like this: the probability and the consequence. If the probability is really high and the consequence is low, then we give it a low, but the probability is high and the consequence is high, well, then that's, very, very high risk. So, and then for those things that are really unknown, and here we can just, I give you COVID-19, when the uncertainty about the future is great, then we're typically looking at scenario analysis or wargaming or business wargaming. And that is, we're wanting to explore some extreme spaces. So we have an uncertainty envelope out there, and we want to explore scenarios that are at the corners or the outer edges of that uncertainty envelope, and think through all the possible outcomes. I'm a big fan of Dwight Eisenhower's famous phrase: planning is everything, plans are nothing. And the value of planning is going through all the different possible outcomes and the risks and thinking through the contingencies. Why? Because you have to act faster than your competitor. And if you don't, you're going to be dead, you're going to be gone. So this is about going faster. There's never been a greater imperative for speed. And if you want to be fast, you need to have thought through all the possible things that can happen in the future. So that you can get there. More on that if you want to read Christian Brose's book, The Kill Chain. You want to look at John Boyd, talk about OODA loops, orient, observe, orient, decide, act. You want to go back to Walter Short and W. Edwards Deming, plan, do, check, act cycle. You want to get into the counterterrorism cycle, F3EA, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze. All those things are about one thing. It's about, assessing the environment, the understand part, the decision part, and the act part. And that understand, decide, act cycle, what Bros would call the kill chain, what I would just call the decision cycle, is that if you do that faster than your competitor, you're going to win. All right, all things equal. But changing the organization is difficult. Now we appeal to our good old friend, and I do say old, 16th century, Niccolo Machiavelli. Many of you know him from his book, The Prince. He wrote others, including a book on strategy, but he basically said, look, it's really, really difficult to change things. Why? Because people aren't going to believe in anything new until they've actually had an experience of it. 2.5 years ago, I had really difficult time explaining to people or getting their attention about how uncertain the future of the world could be. I used to talk to them about how, if you want to understand the future, you need to not think about anything post-1945. Just stop. That's an anomaly. If you want to understand how uncertain the future is going to be, you need to look at about I used to say 1898 to 1914, right? Plurality in terms of world powers. You had disease that could take out large swaths of populations. We were very, very globally integrated as an economy, but the uncertainty was really, really high. Now, post-pandemic, I tend to get more believers. Why? Because people have had an experience of it. And as I like to say, and I tell my 12-year-old son, experience is the most expensive and painful way to learn. But the good part about it, you almost never forget. Okay.